Can I introduce myself to everybody? Some people may not know me. I'm John Laker. I'm one of the directors of Marlow Energy Group, and I'll be hopefully coping with the whole session this evening. Right, we're going to start off with a quick video. All right, this is an introduction video made for us, and you'll see by who during the film. Marlow residents are concerned about a climate crisis. That is why the Marlow Energy Group, MEG, exists. We have less than 10 years to reverse decades of damage. MEG's mission is to achieve carbon neutrality in Marlow by 2030. So, how do we do this? Sharing solutions with Marlow householders, organisations, companies and schools. Promoting energy saving and renewable energy generation to all. Seeking small and large projects in and around the town. We need you and you to volunteer to share this extremely important work. If you have a little time, some enthusiasm and/or a few skills, please email us at marlowenergygroup@gmail.com or visit our website www.marlowenergygroup.com. We will be delighted to hear from you. We would like to thank both Marlow Bridge Rotary Club and the NFU Mutual Marlow for their generosity in making this video for MEG. Right, hopefully everyone saw that. Yes? Good. Righto. Right, the format of the evening is that Ed is obviously our main speaker. Martin may add a few bits and pieces after that. If you have questions, can you stick them in the chat? There'll probably be time for people to stick up their hands and ask questions in person later on. So if you wish to do that, that's probably fine as well. So let's introduce Ed. I'll just give a couple of bits about Ed. Ed is the Managing Director of Scientists Warning Europe and is the leading Scientists Warning Europe delegation at COP26. Locally, Ed is chairman of the Hazelmere Parish Council Climate Emergency Working Party, and they won the Red Kite Prize for B Squared, and they beat us because we had Marlow Solar Streets in it, and I think we came second. Anyway, and he's also a unitary councillor for Buckinghamshire, elected on the One policy of Climate Action Now. So, over to Ed.
Great, thank you very much, John. Would you be able to transfer over the host then to me, please, so I can share screen easily?
Hopefully that's done.
Okay, that's great. And I just, hello everybody, very pleased to be here. Quick apology that I'm often better prepared for talks, but I'm right in the middle of a massive amount of work getting ready for COP26. So in fact, this may be a little bit more off the cuff than it might have been normally. And I also, having heard about Martin's great experience on COPs and knowledge, I'm very happy if you just interrupt me, Martin, if I get it wrong or you want to add anything, that's absolutely fine. And my intention really is to sort of get started and go through a little bit of background to COPs and what, you know, where they've come from, what they're doing, and then go into actually tell you about what we're doing to give you some sort of knowledge about what we're trying to achieve at the COP, and possibly talk a little bit about the admin side of actually what it's like preparing for a COP, if no one else has ever been there or been going to it. But I've never been to a COP before, so this is absolutely my first one, and I'm very much learning as we go along. So we're talking about COPs. I mean, it really starts with obviously the history of the United Nations, and obviously, I mean, people may well know, but at the end of World War II, 50 nations got together in San Francisco to look at how they could avoid having another war, the like of World War II, and that was after 2 months of negotiations, they signed an agreement, and a few months later on, the United Nations was born. I mean, that's effectively the start of the whole process. And then the COPs come out of a series of meetings happening around 1989 and 90. Now I'm going to go to share my screen to refer to some other information. Okay, so can everybody see the screen I'm sharing?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a presentation. It's actually available online, but it's very good. So rather than me creating one, this is what I'm just going to use as the background to chatting about it. But before we actually really get into what happened at the beginning in the history of the United Nations, there is a sort of seminal meeting of the United Nations as it was coming to it, where Margaret Thatcher was talking, and I know that the Conservatives may not be seen as the now.
Margaret Thatcher became the first world leader to warn about the dangers of global warming.
The danger of global warming is as yet unseen, but real enough for us to make changes and sacrifices so that we do not live at the expense of future generations. That prospect is a new factor in human affairs. It's comparable in its implications to the discovery of how to split the atom. Indeed, its results could be even more far-reaching. No generation has a freehold on this earth. All we have is a life tenancy with a full repairing lease.
So Margaret Thatcher was pretty much ahead of the game from a political point of view. And was very, hang on, I now need to get back to my, where have I gone? Here we go. Okay, so, and that was in 1989, and then you're coming through Rio de Janeiro afterwards. And as we move through, the IPCC's first assessment came out as well in 1990 at Rio de Janeiro, telling us that we have to keep the temperatures, or that temperatures had already risen between 0.3 and 0.6 over the last 100 years. The UN Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, getting together and trying to say that we're trying to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, and creating the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So that goes on to be ratified by 195 nations. And then we come to the first COP. So 1995, the first COP, and another IPCC assessment report saying that very substantial cuts in emissions are required and that global warming is most likely due to human activity. So that's in 1995. Now that they've agreed as well that there has to be a legal instrument drafted for adoption at COP3 in order to obligate countries to take action. Geneva happens, COP2, and then COP3 is Kyoto, where the Kyoto Protocol was signed, setting out legally binding emissions for developed countries, except that they didn't actually specify what the details were of it in Kyoto at the time. And that was being left off to even more COPs in the future. COP24, Buenos Aires, COP5 in Bonn in 1999, and then in 2000, COP6 in The Hague. And this is the point where the US says it's withdrawing from the Kyoto Protocol under George Bush, and saying that it doesn't work in fundamental ways for America. Marrakesh in 2001, where there's the Marrakesh Accords giving details for the Kyoto Protocol, and saying the next IPCC, the third assessment report, that it's likely, above a 2/3 probability, that warming of the Earth's climate is caused by humans. The global average surface temperature has increased over the 20th century by about 0.6 degrees. So that's 20 years ago. We go through another COP in New Delhi, another in Milan, yet a second one in Buenos Aires. and then we come to Montreal in 2005. The Kyoto Protocol comes into force with more than 30 of the industrialized countries adopting emissions reductions targets. Those countries committing to reducing emissions by small amounts, 5 to 8% in the period 2008 to 12. But Nick Stern also brings out his review at the time, saying that climate change is the greatest and widest ranging market failure ever seen. The benefits of strong early action far outweigh the costs of not acting. And then he projects, and I know that these have been, people have debated these in many times as to whether these are correct or not, but that if we don't act, the overall cost and risks of climate change will be the equivalent to losing at least 5% of GDP each year, but that taken on an even wider basis, the damage could rise up to 20% of GDP. 2006, Nairobi, and we get the IPCC's 4th assessment report. Warming of the climate system is now unequivocal, and it's very likely, above 90% probability, that warming of the Earth's climate is caused principally by human emissions of greenhouse gases. We're marching gradually along the road to actually saying that we're damaging the climate and actually doing very little about it still at this point. COP13 in Bali, 2007, acknowledging Kyoto's limited scope, governments agree to the Bali Roadmap, a new plan to get globally binding agreement in the next 2 years and to move us on in a number of places to help curb emissions and get cooperative action in a number of areas, including finance and adaptation. COP14 in Poznan takes place, and then Copenhagen. And you see the jokes of the name made around it, because a lot of hopes were held out for Copenhagen. Sorry, Martin, I see you leaning forward. Did you want to say something?
No, I'm just listening.
That's fine. So a lot of hopes were held out for Copenhagen being an absolutely crucial moment. And I think that may be how we're feeling as we come into to COP26. But the parties failed to reach agreement on binding commitments after the initial period for the Kyoto Protocol expired. So they had the first period, it came to an expiration date, and then they couldn't agree how to increase those commitments and how to make them binding. But the Copenhagen Accord accepted the scientific case at the time for keeping the temperature rise to 2 degrees. Developed countries at this time also essentially agreed to provide 100 billion per year for funding of the developing nations, curbing emissions and adapting to the problems of climate change, which are going to be worse for them and already are worse for them. 2010 in Cancun, the Green Climate Fund was set up as a mechanism for raising and dispersing climate finance, and the 2-degree target is formalized as an objective. Durban, 2011. There is an agreement to develop an agreement with legal force under the convention applicable to all parties by 2015. The sad part about a lot of what seems to have happened in COPs in the past is there's a lot of agreements to find agreements, or agreements to spend time trying to find legal structures and binding regulations. 2012 Doha, and then COP19 in Warsaw in 2013. A loss and damage mechanisms established to address the impacts of climate change, including the extreme events that are happening to people who are particularly vulnerable. We now see the IPCC's 5th assessment report saying it's extremely likely, over 95% probability, that human influence has been the dominant cause of the observed global warming since 1950. Well, COP19 in Warsaw was a moving forward, but really we didn't move forward enough and take enough action even at that point. COP20, 2014, Lima, COP21 in Paris. This is where notable action took place. We've all heard about the Paris Accord, the Paris Agreement. 195 nations saying that we're going to keep ourselves well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees. The nations submit their first climate pledges. These are the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, not binding, but commitments of countries to take action to reduce emissions and to deal with the crisis. And then every 5 years, it's planned that there will be a global stocktake and a ratchet up mechanism, which will raise national pledges over time so that they deliver the agreed temperature targets. Now, the idea of the ratchet mechanisms is that they're always going up. So the idea is that the first NDCs that are committed to are the baseline, and then based, and you see down the bottom, on these global stock takes, so a review of what's happening in terms of global emissions, and then those NDCs are meant to be being ratcheted up in order to finally keep to the area and keep us safe with the under 2 degrees and preferably under 1.5 degrees. Well, let's just go to here for a second. So this is what it looked like.
Paris pour le climat est accepté.
We have achieved the Paris Agreement. More countries have come together here to sign this agreement than for any other cause in the history of humankind.
That is why our gathering today is historic. We are all in this together. We will make ours a better world.
Today is a day for our children, grandchildren, and all generations to come.
The future is ours, and the future is bright.
Okay. So everybody was very positive at the point of the Paris Agreement. And even John Kerry, he made a speech there, you saw him there briefly, saying how wonderful it was, how everything was going to work and how everyone was going to come together and solve it. But it didn't happen quite like that in the coming days or in the coming years. We went on through 2016, so COP22 in Marrakesh, with the US announcing it's withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, but it's still bound by it to begin with. We have COP23 Fiji 2017, the 1.5 target being seen as possible, but requiring deep emissions reductions in all sectors. So this is the IPCC's special report on 1.5 degrees. So a unique report brought out to see if we were doing everything we could to keep ourselves under 1.5 degrees. And rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. Global net human-caused emissions of carbon dioxide would need to fall by 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, reaching net zero around 2050. That 45% figure comes up again and again and again as we move forward. Then you come to COP24 in Katowice. The rule book, being the operating manual for implementing the Paris Agreement, was being worked on, and it was largely agreed. And you see plenty of these bits where actually things aren't completely agreed, which often stymies them moving forward. But something else quite special happened, as we all probably know, at COP24 in Katowice, and that was Greta Thunberg's speech. And it's worth, from my perspective, just mentioning a little bit the scientist warnings that I work on. I can say a little bit more later on. There are 3 major scientist warnings signed by tens of thousands of scientists. In about 2017, a gentleman called Stuart Scott took it upon himself to do outreach for these scientist warnings, as he was amazed that people didn't know about them and people weren't taking action. And so he went, and at many of the COPs, he ran a lot of media events talking about scientist warnings, interviewing scientists. Stuart I know personally, and very, very sadly, he died about 3 months ago of cancer and has been fighting it for a long time. But he happens to be the person who spotted on a newscast a little girl sitting outside the Swedish Parliament. And so he immediately went over to Sweden to meet her and then invited her to come to Katowice and COP24. He got her a badge to come there and organized everything about her visit. So let me now, yeah. Sorry, I'm trying to get away from my, let me move this. 1 second. Okay. I'm trying to move my bar at the top. How do I get rid of it? Okay. Sorry, everybody. I'm trying to just get rid of this.
Whilst there's a small gap, can I just ask people to put themselves on mute if they're not on mute already, please?
Okay, done. Right. So I thought a little bit in honor of what she did. It's not
And
long,
if a few
but maybe
children
we
can
should
get
remind
headlines.
ourselves what was
My
said.
name is Greta Thunberg. I am 15 years old and I'm from Sweden. I speak on behalf of climate justice now. Many people say that Sweden is just a small country and it doesn't matter what we do. But I've learned that you are never too small to make a difference. And if a few children can get headlines all over the world just by not going to school, then imagine what we could all do together if we really wanted to. But to do that, we have to speak clearly, no matter how uncomfortable that may be. You only speak of green, eternal economic growth because you are too scared of being unpopular. You only talk about moving forward with the same bad ideas that got us into this mess, even when the only sensible thing to do is pull the emergency brake. You are not mature enough to tell it like it is. Even that burden you leave to us children.
Okay, I'm skipping on a little bit to nearer the end.
Change the system itself. We have not come here to beg world leaders to care. You have ignored us in the past and you will ignore us again. We have run out of excuses and we are running out of time. We have come here to let you know that change is coming, whether you like it or not. The real power belongs to the people. Thank you.
Right. I mean, just coming back to our timeline, she talks about the issue for the politicians. And one of the issues for the politicians, which I feel more keenly as I have stuck my head above the parapet as a little politician trying to do things, is, and although I'm very clear about what I'm doing, is they're caught between a rock and a hard place. If they take the very big actions which they morally must do to keep us safe and to do the right things, then they are inevitably going to make our life in the short term actually quite uncomfortable. And so that's why they're not doing it.
So many people were involved in these.
Somebody may not be muted. Okay. And then what we need to do is to get them to realize that that's the right thing to be doing, because the alternative is they keep putting it off. We keep having our comfortable lives at the moment, and we never get to taking the big action that we really need to take. Okay, so we came to COP25 in Chile, which was actually held in Madrid because it had to be moved due to the problems that were happening in Chile. It was an opportunity for countries to start put forward more ambitious targets ready for COP26 and to finalize the rules for an international market mechanism for carbon trading. We know what happens in 2021, COVID hits us, and then we're up to the present day and we're looking at Glasgow. So, I mean, in thoughts for Glasgow that are actually, I mean, the ones in front of us, this is for the nations now to update their NDCs coming into Glasgow to show much more commitments and what they're trying to do in the future, and for us to create the long-term strategies to guide the NDCs in the future and the raising of the ambitions. And some notes, we also have to, at COP26, finalize the 100 billion that the developed countries are meant to be putting there for the underdeveloped countries to help them reduce emissions while also leveling up at the same time as adapting to what's already affecting them. Well, where are we actually getting to on this? Are we actually getting anywhere that's going to help us? Well, sadly not, so far, because there's been an NDC synthesis about getting ready for COP26. And this is suggested, if we look at, here's just a diagram to show, can you see the diagram as well? Just to explain it, the red box is the NDCs. So we've had updated NDCs from more than 2/3 of the participants coming into COP26. And those NDCs show that if they're all 100% carried out, which they never have been in the past, that we will still raise greenhouse gas emissions by, I think it's 12 or 14% by the time we get to 2030. And yet, if you go back to what was said in 2018, we said we had to drop those emissions by 45%. So instead of dropping them by 45%, they're going to actually go up by 12 or 14% as we come into 2030. There was another point as well, is the report in 2018, when it was looking at the dates when we might or may not go past 1.5 degrees, showed it being in a quite distant future. But the latest, the 6th assessment report of the IPCC coming into this COP, if you look at the scenarios for going to 1.5 degrees, and these are ones where we're going to emit a lot or less or really follow the NDCs, they end up, if you take the midpoints of these scenarios for where we go over 1.5 degrees, we will go over 1.5 degrees in between 2027 and 2035. So the most optimistic path in its midpoint for going over 1.5 is 2035. So that's the position we are as we go into COP26. We have to now get the leaders to take the massive action that we want them to do there. So coming now to talk about what we're doing in relation to COP26 and scientist warning, give you a flavour of it. So there's two main things. So one is that we just had 15 top scientists and a couple of other experts writing a new major scientists warning. So it's called the World Scientists Warning, Warnings into Action. So in 1992, the world scientists warned us we were on a collision with the biosphere, and 1,700 scientists issued that warning. In 2017, they issued another warning on the 25th anniversary, saying that the previous scientists in 1992 were correct. We'd done absolutely nothing. As we can see from going through a lot of the COPs, very little was done. And in fact, the thing had got worse and accelerated. So you also see in the COPs how the IPCC is continually upgrading its assessment of how much we've affected the climate and whether it's us or not. Well, it's the same on the warnings. Things have been accelerating. And the one issued in 2017 was issued by 15,500 scientists telling us what we needed to do. And then in 2019, the third great warning was the Scientists' Warning of a Climate Emergency, which was issued by 11,500 scientists. Now, we have just created the fourth warning. So many of the authors of the last two warnings are either sitting on our boards or on our advisory panels, and some of those that aren't came together again to write another warning. And the latest warning is it's a World Scientist Warning into Actions paper. It's an 8,000-word paper, and there's no new science in it, as there isn't in any of these warnings, as there isn't in any UN reports either. They're reviews of the scientific papers that have gone on, with people then giving their view who are experienced as to what the likely prognosis will be. The warnings are, the latest warning, the same as the last ones, have 6 areas of stressor. So nature, food, economy, energy, pollutants, and population. And what we're doing is we've projected to the leaders at COP26 what needs to be done, but also to people at other levels, of local authorities as it comes down to community action, just like the Marlow Energy Group. And you'll see in their recommendations on energy and everything else. Now, the paper is now just out, and we've been asking scientists to come in and sign it. We're over 1,000 at the moment, and we have a group of about 15 volunteers working, where we have volunteers now particularly targeting countries which haven't signed, to try and make sure that we get a scientist from every single country in the world signing, and that work will go on until the end of COP, and then we'll continue taking more signatories afterwards. So that's one thing that's happening absolutely now. The second thing that we've done as Scientists Warning Europe, and this is the thing where I just didn't want it to go out in, on a video until a few days from now. We issued a letter to Boris Johnson, which was backing up a letter from James Hansen in February of this year. And now we're issuing another letter, particularly targeted for action, getting action going at COP, but it's quite unusual coming from the scientists. And it's written to the Right Honourable Boris Johnson, Prime Minister, and to the President of the Council of Ministers, Professor Mario Draghi, who's the Prime Minister in Italy, as they are both as we are jointly holding the COP. And I'll read it to you. So, dear Prime Ministers of UK and Italy, we write to you in your capacity as co-host of COP26. We refer to our previous letter to Prime Minister Johnson on 12th of February this year in support of the letter from Dr. James E. Hansen. We finished this previous letter with a quote by Winston Churchill. History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it. We call on you both now to follow Mr. Churchill, pick up your pens and write the chapter in future history books entitled The Leaders That Finally Solved the Climate Crisis. We agree with David Attenborough that if we don't act now, it will be too late. Sir David has, with tens of thousands of other scientists, been raising the alarm on the climate and biodiversity crisis for decades. The first World Scientist Warning to Humanity was issued back in 1992. Action has been put off or watered down for many years, decades even, by financial or business interests or due to political expediency. The proverbial can has been kicked firmly down the road, but the road has ended at a cliff edge, and the can teeters terrifyingly on this edge. The scientific world has done all it can to give you and other politicians the scientific advice needed to make the vitally important decisions required. Now you must take up your pens and write yourselves into the world's history books by selecting net zero targets for the UK and Italy significantly in advance of 2050. For us to have any chance of staying under the 1.5 degrees C threshold identified in the Paris Agreement, this should ideally be 2030 or as near as possible. In this letter, we avoid stating the latest scientific facts to you again. What is the point? The scientific world has researched and reported, peer-reviewed and presented, report after report after report. Most scientists are quite frankly fed up. The dire facts have all been presented, re-presented and re-examined time and again. Now it is the 12th hour, a minute before midnight. Now is the time for moral courage and real leadership. As Prime Minister Draghi has said before, we now need to do whatever it takes. All current politicians of whatever level and wherever in the world must be aware they will be called to account for their actions or inaction in the face of the climate crisis, not only in the ballot box, but also by their children and grandchildren in the living room and around the breakfast table. You are the prime ministers of two of the most advanced and respected nations of the world, members of the G7 and joint hosts of COP26. This is the most important event in the history of the planet. We've been told by Sir David Attenborough to act now or it will be too late. And John Kerry has said, COP26 is humanity's best last chance. We put it to you, Prime Ministers, that it is also your best last chance to truly step up, be hugely more ambitious than in the past, and lead the world at this crucial moment in time. We again offer our commitment and help to you in achieving it. This is going to be issued hopefully now tomorrow morning. We're still waiting for some scientists to come in and say that they've agreed it, but some of you will know the names. We have about 20 or 30 scientists who've agreed, but James Hansen is signing it, Kevin Anderson is, Sir David King, Mark Maslin, Chris Rapley, OBE, and then from abroad, Bill Rees, Bill Lawrence and Bill Mumau, all of whom are highly acclaimed climate and environmental scientists. And this will be issued by us as part of our preparations leading into the COP. That's probably all I have to say, actually. So I think I'll leave it there, John, if that's okay, and invite Martin if he'd like to say anything.
Yeah, that's fine, Ed. Yes, I would, before we take any questions, I would like Martin to contribute if he wishes to, and then we can ask questions of both people, as it were. So if I can pass it back to you, Martin.
Yes, well, I mean, thank you very much. A very interesting overview of the history of all this and how we've got to where we are and the important aspects in the future that we've got to address. And I suppose, I mean, most of the work I do is on the demand side, is working with organizations in many ways to use energy as efficiently as possible, which has two dimensions to it. One of them is saving money, buying less, and the other, of course, is that we've got fossil fuel supplies with carbon footprints, so using less, we're helping address the climate change issues. And one of the, of course, the interesting balance here, it'll be interesting to see how this comes up in COP26. If we simply go to, okay, the answer is just let's do away with fossil fuels completely, and we've got renewables and we've got nuclear power, problem solved. Climate emissions are addressed. And then if organizations want to waste as much energy as they like, it's up to them, they've got to pay for it. But of course, the transition to that is going to take a while. And in any event, organizations have a responsibility for a variety of reasons to not waste their money. So the important part really of this is the demand side and getting organizations to understand and use energy as efficiently as possible. So they're saving money and of course they're reducing their carbon footprint effectively in terms of the environmental implications. So it'll be very interesting to see what comes out of COP26 in terms of, is there a balance between those two aspects? And we've certainly got a lot of input going in, hopefully, to that with initiatives that are happening at the moment. And of course, the important initiatives that we've got at the moment are the local groups in the country, as we've seen, the Marlow Energy Group. We have the Greener Henley project. We've got the Maidenhead initiatives that are going on there. So local groups are engaged. And of course, that is the people themselves. You know, your responsibilities with your life to use energy as efficiently as you can, avoiding wastage and all the environmental issues, recycling and so on. So that's an important new dimension. And in one of the organizations that I work with, the Energy Services and Trade Association, we've recently set up the Energy Conscious Organization Initiative, which is one where whatever you do in your organization, everyone who works there has got an environmental responsibility. So, you know, when you go to lunch, you make sure things are turned off. At the weekends when no one is there, everything is turned off. And is all that monitored? And we now have a certification scheme which checks that that is happening. And if it is the case, then you get that certification to the Energy Conscious Organization Initiative. And part of the links there, of course, to your lifestyle. Okay, doing all this at the office, when you go home, is your lifestyle still being addressed in terms of energy and the environment? And of course, the groups like Marlow Energy Group are very much helping people to do that. So it'll be very interesting to see whether COP26 does actually give a profile to this in terms of an important dimension in the future. And so I've agreed to give a talk, I think, towards the end of November on the outcome of COP26. So we'll see what comes from that. And I can certainly give a bit more information there on a lot of the demand side activities that are growing rapidly at the moment. I mean, for instance, in Europe, I'm the chairman of the British Standards Institute Committee on Energy Management Standards, and we have a working group in Europe for all European countries on behaviour change. What are they all doing? And we're feeding into that what the UK is doing. And of course, you've got a lot of challenging cultural problems. You can't just have standards and regulations applying to all countries, because different countries have got very different visions and approaches to how you address this. So it's quite a challenging area. So for the talk I'm giving next month, I can give an update on a lot of this and hopefully see how that has engaged or been engaged with the outcome of COP26. But a very interesting perspective today, Ed, from you in terms of how we've got to this point and the important commitment we have globally to address the climate change issues.
So, Martin, thank you very much. Do we have any questions, either in the chat? I don't think we've got anything in the chat apart from Pike Ngoma said the topic is great and very touching if we won't do anything about climate change. So thank you for that comment. Do we have any questions from the floor, as it were? Please unmute yourself if you do.
I've got a question,
Dave.
John, if I may.
Yep.
I've heard quite a lot of info about the COP so far, and the fact that most of the commitments that people make at COPs are normally made beforehand, and to do that, governments will have to get approval and such like. So they'll have already got in their back pocket what they're going to deliver. So, and we know it's woefully inadequate. What do you think could realistically be achieved at this COP, given the fact that we're just not got there so far? It appears so, anyway.
Yes, and you're absolutely right. And that's the figure I was giving on the nationally determined contributions are actually all part of that preparation. So 2/3 of them are already updated, ready for this COP. Although there was actually another review of any that were finally updated, which was coming out probably today or yesterday, which I haven't looked at. So there's another update, but I don't suppose it changes much. Yeah, and I have to say, my view of what might happen in COP, I actually have a sort of a bet, not a bet, but my feeling is Boris Johnson could pull a rabbit out the hat from the point of view of climate. And it's a feeling that he is so determined to make his place in history and to find himself written into the history books to some extent, that he would, with the right wind behind him, pull something out and commit us to something that's well beyond where we are now, 2040, 2035, net zero, something like that. I don't think it's going to happen, but I do see an outside chance with Boris Johnson's personality that that could happen. That would be great. Alternatively, I think I don't feel very positive about it. Obviously, we're going there with great hopes and trying to push them to do a lot of things. Yeah. I hope that the 100 billion gets agreed and sorted. That's really important for all the nations in the developing countries, and it should have been sorted already. I mean, it's ridiculous that it hasn't been. So I think that can get done. I don't hold out great hope for anything else, but maybe, just maybe, we get through to these politicians who finally realise that, you know, there is no more road to go on, and they've got to take the action. I'm just hoping that Boris has that personality. It might be him, but maybe it will be one of the others. We need the G20. All it needs is the G20 to get together and decide to go for it, and then we've solved the problem solved.
Got anything to add, Martin?
Well, I think an important aspect here is the focus on what is happening now. It's all very well having the targets out to 2035 and 2050. What are we doing now? And as I said earlier, I think the local groups that we've got and engaging with business is an important dimension of that. We can present that this is what's happening. And these initiatives have only started in the last few years. So it's an important dimension to that we're getting everyone involved in the workplace and in their private life with their commitment to the environment. And let's hope that that comes up as an important perspective of the outcome of COP26.
Okay, thank you.
And it'd be good, perhaps, Ed, if you and I could just have an exchange after COP26 on your views as to the outcome and mine, and we can then, I'm happy to, you know, engage your views in the presentation I'm giving in November.
Yeah, no, great. Let me know. Very interesting to see what it's like from the inside.
Yes. Well, you're based locally, are you? We could meet up, perhaps.
Yes, Hazelmere.
Okay.
Yeah, just as a minor interlude, as it were, while we wait for another question, I'll just share the screen. Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
That's our next talk. This is COP26-2, I think, and where Martin will be talking about what was achieved and what wasn't.
Yes.
So we'll find that out later on. But that is on the 22nd of November on Monday, and we will be glad to see people at that as well.
Yes.
Right, back to questions. Trevor Braun.
Right, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
It's just a question for Ed, really. Our politicians are really good at making statements, but there's nothing to back them up. There's no plan that actually indicates how they're going to get to where they say. And that's my main concern, really, that, you know, we can get good statements that come out of COP26, but there ought to be like an annual review.
Yes.
To actually check that we're on target, really.
Yes. What are we actually doing?
Yes. I mean, you're absolutely right, and the review process isn't terribly good. And I mean, you know, I wasn't aware of the review processes they had in COP. In COP, I did show them to you, but they're every 5 years, which is clearly woefully inadequate. Particularly now we're in this rapidly accelerating level of climate change, and if we hit tipping points, we need to review them on a monthly basis. Actually, if we start going to tipping points, I mean, the methane release from underneath the ice shelves. I mean, not only could it be vast, and in one projection of what's under the Siberian ice shelf, the methane is likely to get released somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees. When it has finally thawed and it starts being released, one assessment is suggesting that 8% of that methane could be released in the space of about 2 years. And that on its own could heat the planet on, there's two different studies, one saying 1.2 degrees of warming, and that could come in 2 years if we melt the permafrost. So, you know, and if we don't have benchmarks for everything we're doing and then consistent monitoring, we're in really, really serious trouble. And that's one of the biggest problems. So, and when as I was preparing for this and going through just those dates on all the COPs, the frustration of the idea that all these IPCC reports are edging towards getting worse and worse, you know, and each time they're talking about they're going to agree at the next one, they're going to agree to have a meeting to agree some binding commitments. I mean, you know, we absolutely never get anywhere. I think if we look on the bright side, so if I go positive and then negative, Britain is actually quite a leader, bizarrely, you know, and our targets for gas boilers, our targets for getting rid of fossil fuel cars are actually quite leading. The problem is we're leading a pack who are going to fail to finish the race, because we're not going to get there on time. And it's completely useless us being at the front of a pack that is not going to achieve the target. What we have got to be is we've got to go out there to be well ahead of the pack, to be over the curve, to show the example. And both because we are big, industrialized, wealthy, we caused a lot of the damage, we started the Industrial Revolution, we have the advantage of English language and a whole load of other things why people notice us well above our weight. And if we went out and picked a 2030 net zero target and got on with it, or 2035 or whatever, we really, really could change the game. I mean, you see China at 2060, you see Australia begrudgingly coming in now at 2050. And if we were out at 2030, it wouldn't be at 2060. Russia would be at 2045, Australia would be at 2035, and the whole thing would start coming forwards. And that's what we've got to do. And we are, I'm not at all, I'm not a conservative, I'm an independent, and I'm not a conservative because of climate, but the Conservative Party will be in control for the next 6 years. And what we need to do is to get them to really grip this and go forwards, which I do believe they could do.
Yeah,
yeah. We've got to get the message across.
Yes, I would agree with that. Yeah, I think they can. Yes.
Right. We've got a question in the chat asking on behalf of the youth in Africa, what major roles should us youth play after COP26 to make sure that climate change demands are met by our global leaders?
Well, I certainly think the younger generation have got a key role to be engaged here. And it's good that Greta is going to be giving a talk, I think, at COP26. And it's very important to get the younger generation engaged, yes.
I think that just one quick comment on the younger generation is extremely important, the demonstrations and everything done.
Yeah.
But anybody who is anywhere who's over the age of 50, it's our responsibility. It's really like 50-year-olds and above who are the MPs, the managing directors of the companies, and control a lot of the stuff. There aren't very many 18 or 20-year-olds that control it. And if we don't deal with it now, it'll be too late by the time all these enlightened youngsters get up to the point where they can do it for themselves.
Yeah, but I think it's pressure from the youngsters that we have to be addressing this. Okay, us older ones, the people that can do it, but it's pressure from that generation that, you know, it's them when they're our age, that the world will have changed dramatically if we, the older ones, don't address it now.
It's absolutely right. There is one thing to be wary of, and it may be, people may realize that here, is that in fact, when you look at all the statistics, the older age group are more worried about climate change than the younger group. So in fact, all the stats from the UN, from the government, and then actually Hazemi a little bit we did, my own experience on the doorstep is pensioners and older people are really worried. Now, whether it's because they've got more time to be worried, whether it's because of a bit of guilt or whatever, or they're worried for their children and grandchildren, but they're really worried. Whereas a lot of the youth, not all, Greta Thunberg is not unique. There are plenty like her, but very caught up in the activities of being youthful, as probably all of us were when we were, and aren't actually as active on it as the older generation.
Yeah.
Before I go to Steve, I will go to you in a minute, Steve. We've got a question in chat. Owen, do you want me to read it out, or do you want to say your words?
No, I'm happy to read it out. I mean, I thought the point Ed made about you know, how do we actually get people to vote the right way effectively, so politicians feel that they can do the right thing and not lose their jobs, I think is really key.
Yeah.
And at the moment, my concern is that the democratic process actually doesn't help us in the way we're doing it, because we're not managing to shift those votes. So really shifting those votes is an absolutely key thing we have to do. And we need to do that locally, obviously as far as we can, and wider if we have the bigger base. But I mean, taking it very locally, as I put in the chat, how do we get our local authorities to actually do what we think is right from an energy point of view, what we think is right from a climate change point of view, because they really do seem completely entrenched. And I mean, I put the example in the chat of this 3.9 million investment in Westhorpe interchange, which is entirely to do with getting a higher vehicle throughput, and as well as lots of concerns I have about whether that was actually a democratic process anyway. But it just seems to me that their priorities are completely wrong. That money should be invested much better. Ed, what are your comments on that, given that you see bucks in a close-up way?
Yeah, I don't know the details, the one you're saying, but you just have to mention HS2 in a general thing about how completely ridiculous that we're still spending all that time and money and destroying everything in these circumstances. So, which is similar. Thinking about how do we get the politicians to move forward and things like that, at the start of your question, it is interesting that I even got elected to the Unitary Council, which is significant because I'm an independent in, just like Marlow, in a very, very conservative area. And I'm not an anti-conservative in any sort of way, but I had only one policy, which was climate action. So, and I came second in Hazelmere, which means that I defeated two of the Conservatives with only the one policy of climate action. So that suggests to me that in fact, people are ready for it. People are prepared to support it, but we've got to get out there and do it. So the first thing would be to anybody on this call, if there's any parish councillors or town councillors or whatever who are here, then they could be getting on with it now. But if they're not, there are often places for co-option on parish and town councils, and you can get yourself, and there are community boards now where you can get yourself involved in the process. But in terms of moving forward, there is one very good example, of course, of how the whole political process was hijacked and changed. And I'm sure everybody here has a very emotive feeling on it, and that's on Brexit. Okay, and before everybody gets on arguing about Brexit, it's not about Brexit. And from the point of view of climate change, it won't matter which side of the bus you're on when it goes off the cliff. So it's completely irrelevant from the point of view of climate change. Not irrelevant, but almost irrelevant. But what happened there is you had a number of parties, or a movement, let's say, that never got to power, whose leader never really got anywhere, the loudest man in the pub, or however you would view him. But he did change the face of British politics, and he changed our biggest party and our most successful party into the Brexit party, effectively. So if you think about that in climate terms, all of the stats show that climate is now the top issue, or consistently in the top 2 or 3, even with COVID at the same time. We have now more and more interest in it at every single level. We have more than half our councils having declared climate emergencies, and set in the main more than half of them 2030 net zero targets. There is an opportunity for that kind of razor sharp focus that Farage brought to his movement, and do it on climate. And at the same time, you've got that backdrop of the news will get worse. The natural disasters will keep coming. They will keep coming, and they will simply get worse. I mean, the Canadian heat wave, a once in 1,000 years heat wave, said to be by the scientists now 150 times more likely. That's once in every 6.5 years. Well, Canada is on the same latitude as Marlow. Okay, so the likelihood is we are going to have just as many opportunities to have those heat waves. Yeah. And that's only 1.1 degrees. So that it's going to keep ratcheting up. And I do think 2 years ahead from now, we can put huge pressure on them. And if there was a climate movement that stood somebody in every seat where the Conservative Party is weak, I don't mean standing against Greens or anything like that, but standing where they're weak and making climate the main issue of the election, I reckon you'd see a lot of change. They're going to be under pressure anyway. HS2 and planning reform, Greenbelt, will bring them under a lot of pressure as well. And that could be a climate discussion, and you could see hundreds and hundreds of Conservatives and members of Parliament moving over.
Yeah.
We're going to close down in a minute, but there are, I think, 2 questions. We'll end with 2. Steve had a question. If you can unmute, Steve.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. Can someone help me understand what happens once all the commitments are in and all the money is gathered? What is the framework for the distribution and the rationale for moving these committed funds out to the countries that need them most, and how do we think about addressing a challenge as significant and as complex as climate change?
Right. Well, I don't know if Martin knows. I have no idea how they organised to get that 100 billion, if that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
It should be agreed.
No,
I don't know the mechanism for that.
No, I'm asking what happens after we get to 100 billion? What happens next? What is the framework for dealing with that in a responsible, climate change centric manner?
How is that money being used in this context? Yes.
Correct. What is
that must be monitored in some way? Yeah.
Right. What is the mechanism for not just monitoring, but distributing and just dealing with the many aspects of climate change that are going different countries are going to be having different challenges, right? And what is the framework that leads to responsible action to deal with this problem?
Well, there must be a mechanism to engage with the leaders in those countries that this money has got to be appropriately spent.
Right.
And as you say, the cultures are very different. As we're finding with the behavior change work in Europe, you can't have the same rules and regulations in each country. So you've got to have engagement. I don't know the mechanisms, but there must be something in place that there is a link to each country in terms of how their share of that money is going to be spent effectively, not just wasted.
I think.
I suspect some of the money may also go through some of the NGOs.
Yes.
So established charities that are already doing projects in the climate and biodiversity sphere, tree planting, for instance, reforesting, and that some of the money would be allocated to them and then effectively deducted from the amount that was being paid to the country, in a sense. So I suspect some of it goes through the NGOs.
Okay, one quick last question from Penelope, who had her hand up. Have you still got a question, Penelope?
Yes, hi, good evening. It's been really, really interesting. There's a few things that have come up on those. One is the fact that we're doing all that we can in kind of the Buckinghamshire area. I've just moved to Gloucestershire, and but it's how to link everybody up throughout the country to be doing their bit, and it needs to be more of a chain reaction if we can get the whole country doing things to help with this environmental problem, even if it's just over here. And the other thing is to bring, you were mentioning about older people being more concerned, and we are for our grandchildren and to follow, but it's bringing more children or young people on board, and they've got young families and things like that, but it's that generation that we need to be aiming to follow with this, to do things regarding community and climate change, and just keeping the ball rolling after this huge meeting of world leaders. It needs to, we don't need the emphasis to kind of relax after it. It needs to be chased. And the other thing is, it's about the younger generation. I've been since the 70s trying to do something, and was the first one in my road to ever do anything about recycling. But it's just now, actually, the young generation have got to be responsible for the the litter they leave, for their whole thing of just buy something and throw it away. Whereas we never did that when we were younger, but now it's just this throwaway society. So we've got to somehow get them to do their bit. It's not just a few people that are following Greta, and she's not the only one that's doing great things as far as the children's concerned. But 40 years ago, this girl of 12 stood up, and the world hasn't listened. So somehow we have to have more, that the children aren't just taught in primary school, it should go through secondary school, and it has to go through, because in 20 years' time, it's those people that will be doing the jobs that our age group are doing now.
Do you have a question, Penelope?
Well, my question is that how do people think we can get this link, and how do we think we can get it over to the younger generation a little bit more?
Okay.
Really?
I could probably give you a sort of a very fast answer to it. It was a very long question, lots of different bits, but in terms of engaging everybody after COP26, we've got to have some policies that are coming out, and that's going to have to be at a government level and filter down. And there are, I mean, Martin was referring to energy schemes, community energy. Well, I think there's going to be a push at COP26 on localization. I think
yes, I certainly hope that's right. Yeah.
I would have thought that that's something that will filter through a lot in certainly the Western countries about localization. If it does, that's something that can filter down quite quickly down to all of our levels, to our community groups and our parishes and that sort of thing. I think how do we get the action going nationally? Penelope, you've got within the council systems, I mean, the National Association of Local Councils is bringing together 10,000 parish and town councils, and you know that can bring, and it can actually do a lot, and it is trying very hard. It's declared a climate emergency, so there are those links there. But for the young people, I have for individual action, we've all got to do it. And you're absolutely right, particularly young families where there's a lot of consumption going on naturally within a young family. We've got to get on top of that consumption, and we've all got to do it. We've all got to make big changes. And the thing that drives me mad more than anything else is when I hear people tell me they're doing their bit. They generally then tell me they're doing their recycling, and then that's it. But anyway, they tell me they're doing their bit, and I consistently say it isn't enough because we're in an emergency. You have to do a little bit more every single day. So if you have decided, for instance, that you're going to start reducing your meat consumption because of methane, you have to keep doing it. You know, if you decided you're going to drive less, you've got to keep driving less. If you decide you're going to fly less, or all together, keep doing less of it and keep doing good things. So doing things locally. The last bit, though, sorry, Martin, I'll shut up, is we though have to have, for the big actions, the policy actions, it's really the older people. I mean, it's the 40, 50, 60-year-olds in the businesses.
Absolutely.
They're in control of the power, and the young can't do it. So policy needs the older people to deal with it.
Yeah, thank you.
Can we sneak one last question in? Nick had his hand up. Have you still got your question, Nick?
It wasn't a question. I just thought I would give a little response to Steve's question.
Oh, right.
And for me, I think the answer, the most general answer to his question is the Paris Agreement. That it's a very complex and wide-ranging mechanism for all kinds of things. So, for example, loss and damage, which, you know, if developing countries have devastating natural disasters that are linked to climate change, which can be linked to gases, then they should be able to make claims and get recompense. There's the market mechanisms that is on the agenda for this COP, which, if they get it sorted out, will unlock a load of financial transfers for carbon sequestration in developing countries by creating carbon credits. And I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge, but there's a lot of other, I mean, it's hugely complex. There's a lot of aspects to it. So I think the Paris Agreement sets the overall framework going forward.
Good. Before we go, I'm just going to show you a quick slide. Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
you got the message.
Oh, it
Right.
went too quickly.
Before we all go, can I first thank Ed for his excellent talk and for Martin as well for his additional information, and all the speakers and all the people that attended. It's much appreciated. Hopefully we'll see you again for Martin's talk.
Yeah.
Where we'll find out how we have succeeded so
We hope.
much in COP26.
Ed, I'll get back to you, as I said, after COP, and we can perhaps have a discussion around that to get your views on the outcome. Yeah.
No, that's absolutely great. And actually, just a quick appeal. If anybody here actually wants to have an effect at COP, you could do by working with us. We need volunteers for this next 2.5 weeks. We can brief everybody. We've got about 12 to 15 working with us at the moment. And it's simply contacting scientists through the internet, emailing or LinkedIn in other countries. So please, if you've got time over the next couple of weeks, let me know.
Get back to you. Yeah.
Put my email in the chat.
Righto. Thanks, everybody. I'm sorry we've gone a little over time, but I thought it was all very interesting.
Yeah.
And again, thanks for everyone who come, especially a gentleman from Malawi who attended, would you believe? We're international.
Brilliant.
Thanks very much. Cheerio, everyone.
Thanks so much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks. Bye.